through question and answer, and then of course in the poll questions that we do. So if you are interested in getting CPE credits for this, make sure to answer those poll questions. Stay with us the whole time. Participate through the chat feature, the questions feature, and of course the polls that will come through here shortly. So very excited to talk to you today. I'm joined by two amazing gentlemen that we look forward to introducing you to here in a moment. But this is all about volatility in the marketplace and how cash orchestration, which we'll define for you and introduce to you in a little bit, is your competitive advantage in this volatile marketplace. So look forward to talking to you today. My name is Brock Beisel, and I'm joined by Kyle Rogers and Ben Yates. And before I pass it to them, I'd like to say a quick word about who I am and then give them a chance to introduce themselves as well. So my name is Brock Beisel. I'm based out of Atlanta, Georgia. I'm an executive director in our treasury consulting practice. We implement Kyriba, and we do treasury advisory services, bank fee analysis, TMS RFPs, cash pooling and in-house banking design, etc. So very much look forward to talking to you about the treasury components of today's webinar. Next, I'm going to pass it to Ben Yates.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Ben Yates. I'm Brock's equivalent in the order to cash practice. So we handle everything from customer onboarding and credit through the AR subledger, cash application, cash forecasting on the cash inflow side of the house. I'm looking forward to presenting and talking to everyone today. I'll hand things off to Kyle.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Rogers, and I lead the source to pay practice here at Clearsulting. We provide full suite advisory services to clients from everything from supplier onboarding and sourcing and contracting down through to AP and payments and everything in between. A lot of our clients are looking to drive process improvement, policy definition, and a lot of technology transformation in this space, which we're supporting them through. And then, frankly, much more recently, a lot more conversations around working capital and how companies can drive improvement there. And hence why we're having this conversation today. I'll hand back to Brock.
Thank you so much, y'all. Well, let's talk very quickly about who you're listening to as a firm. Clearsulting is a boutique firm that has global reach and is focused on partnering with financial leaders to make sure that everything under the office of the CFO is modernized, operating, performing at its peak potential, whether it's with liquidity, transformation, procurement, order to cash, you name it. We love what we do here. We love working with clients like you and want to make sure that we're providing a lot of value in not only this webinar, but in the engagements you have with us. I see a lot of familiar names in the webinar. I'm so grateful that you're here, and hopefully you feel the impact that Clearsulting has had on your business in the office of the CFO. So we're thankful for your partnership, and we look forward to talking today at length about creating more value through the cash value chain. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kyle in just a moment for the cash landscape and what's at stake, why this matters, the so what. And then we're going to take a deep dive and a double click into the enterprise cash value chain. I think we've got a great diagram to help you think through where in your business you can extract more value or ensure there's optimal efficiency. And then we're going to talk practicalities, right? What framework do you need to have in mind as you think about transforming your business, thinking about being an orchestrator or conductor of cash across your enterprise? And then finally, prioritization considerations and how we think about where to start, quick wins, strategic deployments, et cetera. It may take a little bit more time. So last comment here, there are 4 poll questions throughout this. I will ask the first one here now, and then we'll pass it over to Kyle with thoughtfulness around the answers that you put in, and then of course the cash landscape and what's at stake. So here is your first poll question. Please click your response.
So the poll question here, to read it out loud, is which volatile inputs have disrupted your business in the last 18 months? Is that input costs and commodity pricing, FX and currency volatility, demand unpredictability, supplier reliability, or regulatory and geopolitical shifts? I'm seeing inputs for all of them except for supplier. Oh, actually all of them now. And two of the kind of the front runners are on the input costs and commodity prices, as well as regulatory and geopolitical shifts, which will actually tie in quite nicely into what I'm about to talk about. But these are very common themes we're hearing from our clients today.
So we can close the poll.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk about why working capital is of increasing importance today as opposed to maybe over the last number of years. So it's been 15 plus, over the last 15 plus years, the cost of cash has been effectively zero. So while working capital was important and is important for some companies, it often was not of kind of the top of the agenda. Things like margin expansion, revenue growth, new product development certainly took precedent over cash management. And while those remain important, the changes over the last few years, which I'll talk about, have really driven increased importance and focus around cash management and working capital and how that can not only be deployed effectively and efficiently, but also be wielded to drive incremental gains for internal and stakeholders and shareholders. So what's changed? The cost of capital has certainly increased, which everyone on this phone is aware of. The rate environment is materially different than it was even 5 years ago, creating an environment where the cash sitting on the balance sheet is losing value quite quickly, but also as companies go look to finance investments, that cost and that value proposition has changed materially compared to a few years ago. The second is around geopolitical instability. So input pricing and the variability of those input pricing has changed, frankly, in the last 6 to 12 months. Whereas commodity prices were relatively stable, companies could better forecast and manage not only their spend, but also their revenue. And they had a good view of the impact that inventory had on their balance sheet. Today, we've got clients that are having daily war rooms about how to handle commodity pricing and how that changes day over day, given the impact that has on input prices and their supply chains. Margin pressure has also become a common topic. The inflationary pressures over the last few years have really hit corporate America quite hard, and companies are resisting passing on to customers. So they're finding ways to be more efficient, effective internally, and that isn't always on pricing expansion. Part of it is on cash usage. And then lastly, and this is probably a little bit different than the first three, is around technology enablement. Whereas not even 5 years ago, having a good, clear view of the end-to-end cash conversion cycle was quite challenging. New tools and enablers have made this much more readily available, and executives are challenging their order to cash, their source to pay, and their treasury teams to really provide more real-time and accurate insights around where the cash stands and how it's being deployed. The paradox around this is this cannot be solved in a vacuum, right? There's a reason why Brock from Treasury, Ben from order to cash, and me from source to pay are on this call, because it needs to be delivered cross-functionally. And lastly, while technology is an important enabler to this, it really needs to start from the full operating model, from how you define your incentives, to how you think about negotiating with your customers and your vendors, to how you define your process and data internally to be effective in this space. So I'm going to talk for a minute about how talk about how these all intersect amongst each other. So on the source to pay side, ultimately you're responsible for cash outflows, right? That could be done through front end sourcing and negotiation, where you define your commercial terms, not only unit price, but also payment terms and discount terms, to how you actually issue POs and drive AP and payments on the back end. And then you, on the other end of the spectrum, you have order to cash, which is your cash outflows, right? Where you're doing effectively the inverse on the source to pay side. You're doing your customer management, you're doing your ordering, your AR, and your cash application. And then you have treasury really sitting as the information center between these two cash flow paradigms. The challenge is a bit different across the two. First is between source to pay and treasury, we often see there to be a pretty significant data gap, where not only do you often have fragmented technologies in your purchasing process, whether that be a different contracting tool from a sourcing tool to a PO to an AP tool, but further, oftentimes the business might not be aware of a cash or spend commitment until the invoice arrives. And if you're treasury or the business, that creates a big problem around thinking about cash forecasting and planning. On the order to cash side, it's a bit of a timing gap where you typically have a better sense of what your revenues are. You may have less clarity around when you expect to receive against those revenues, as well as where you might have dilution or write-downs associated with it, which can impact and color the accuracy of those cash forecasts. What we find is the value often will fall through the cracks here for a few reasons. I think an important one is around how KPIs are structured. What we often see is most often leaders' KPIs are often more oriented to the P&L, right? Revenue growth, margin, spend management, et cetera, but are less focused on the balance sheet, which is usually where cash lives and how you calculate areas like this. So, for example, you might have a sourcing manager that's fully willing to concede payment terms in favor of maybe slightly better unit price on the contract, whereas that might not necessarily be the right trade-off for the business. The second is around fragmented data. These often have not only across pillars different technologies, but even within pillars you can have fragmented technologies, which make it very challenging to tie this together. And then that all leads into the timing gaps around how do you get one clear view of the world at a point in time that you can refresh, if not real time, certainly no less than daily. So I'm actually going to hand over to Brock here, and we're going to talk about some additional context. But before that, I'll talk about a polling question. So I'll read this out loud. Who owns the cash conversion cycle metric at your company? Is it the CFO and finance when it's centrally owned, driven, and governed? Is it owned by treasury? Is the inventory piece owned by supply chain, or is it shared across functions with no single owner? And then lastly, maybe you might not track cash conversion all that tightly as an organization. So we're seeing three results kind of come out on front. Two are the big leaders. One is CFO and finance, centrally owned and driven. And then second is shared across functions, no single accountable owner. And I think while there's certainly different responses, there's lots of similarity across the two. And the theme that we want to take away from this is very rarely does the incentive structure and the operating model at companies effectively align to drive effective working capital management.
Yeah, it's clear 37% of people answering this poll have a problem, right? Because there's no single accountable owner, that's guaranteed. And then for the other 37% that said their CFO or their finance are centrally owned, if there's no clear owner and it's just in the CFO's court, chances are it's not being managed closely enough to actually see value, right? So Ben, why don't you talk us through, that this poll question number 2 is done, why don't you talk us through the pain points you see across every assessment you do?
Sure. So, I don't think anything that we just saw based on responses is particularly surprising. There's a little bit of a different flavor of this and which is more of a pain point one place or another. But every time we go in and talk about these process areas, we typically see varying themes that consistently come about. So, if you look at forecasting, forecasting almost everywhere we go is going to be based on a bunch of offline Excel-driven processes, each of which, from an AR perspective, you're looking at AR tranches, 30, 60, 90% likelihood of calculation, thumb in the air, maybe based on some historical norms, potentially, maybe based on a best guess. It's, every time you roll that up from a business unit to a business segment, then up into corporate, each one of those, we're confident on this, but plus minus 10, 20%, that risk of inaccuracy just multiplies, right? So by the time you have a corporate forecast for cash, there's a ton of risk in there. And as a result of that, Treasury has to borrow against worst case scenario for funding. So the less accurate your forecasts are, the more of real world costs you're incurring because you still need to keep the lights on, right? You still need to cash to fund operations. With bad forecasts comes more cost of capital. The second of that is, you're looking at, at forecasting as more of, maybe it's tied to an FP&A cycle. Maybe it's something that happens quarterly, as part of your investor relations process, as opposed to really embedding it in ways of working, right? So it's, whether it's a Hyperion or a consolidation tool, yeah, you're rolling up a cash forecast, but how do you really drive improvements? What is the so what? What is the so what in terms of continuous improvement in the various subledgers, APAR? What is the so what in terms of cash optimization? And then how do I reconcile against inaccurate forecasts? How am I running a postmortem? If I miss my cash forecast by 35%, why? Right? So there's a lot of problems in forecasting. And again, missing on forecasts has real world problems. Yes, it makes you less credible from an investor relations perspective, but operationally, it also incurs more cost. The next two things, which again drive real world outcomes that matter, are on the AP and AR sides of the house, respectively. So you may very well be missing your early pay discounts, right? If you're paying, you've got your 10-2 net 30 structures, and you don't have systemic ways of identifying those, you're just hoping that a manual, AP voucher process is optimized so that you're always paying on, either day 10 or day 30, right? And never before, and ideally never after, right? So how are you making sure that you are taking advantage of all the discounts that are available to you? And then flip side of that is on the collection side of the house, right? How are you making sure that disputes or claims that your customers are making are valid? How are you making sure that if they're claiming that 2% net, 210 net 30 discount, how tight are your gray stays? How much are you allowing? What are your auto write-off thresholds? How do you know your customers aren't gaming the system? If you're a CPG company and you have high volume of trade trade programs, each of which drives incredible volumes of valid and invalid claims, how do you make sure that you are not leaking revenue, which then leads into leaking cash, right? So there are a lot of things that in the middle, if you don't have the right process tools and systems, then you could be, giving away cash that is on the table for you to take. And I think what the last thing that we'll talk about, and this has an impact later on, is manual reactive process. These functions have always been meant to be optimization functions and governance functions. However, they've really had to be data gathering, data entry, keep the lights on, paper pushing functions. Because up until recently, quite frankly, the technology didn't exist to allow them to be what they're supposed to do. So accelerating cash on the front end with order to cash, managing spend intelligently with source to pay, and then optimizing cash and orchestrating cash in the middle with treasury, right? Up until now, it's been offline worksheets, customer Bibles, manual AP vouchering, and and that's even within an ERP. Then you get cross ERP, and now it's even more of a nightmare. So a lot of these challenges and pain points are very similar to what we typically see. All right, so poll question number 3. So what is your biggest barrier to improving your cash conversion cycle, right? Is it data? Is it operating in functional silos? Does the board just not think of this as a strategic opportunity or priority? Do your incentive structures work against it, right? Kyle gave one example. Another is, well, sales gets paid based on contract signing, not against collecting cash, or they're getting paid on volume, not on margin. So they'll always have an incentive to approve, a claim or a deduction because it doesn't hurt their bottom line; it hurts the company's bottom line. Or volatile conditions are making it too hard to figure out what to do, right? You're being battered around in a storm. You don't know what the right answer is. So I'll give people some time to think about that. That there are a lot of different reasons why you might have challenges here in this space. All right, it looks like we're pretty stable. All right, so reading back, system and data gaps, 40%, extremely common. Especially if you have a multi-ERP environment, very difficult to get a single true view of what is true at a corporate level, especially in real time. It's possible to do that for last quarter, very difficult to do that today. Volatile, conditions, absolutely, especially if you have manual offline processes, and data isn't moving through reporting and through decision support in real time, almost impossible given how fast things are moving. And then, yeah, cross-functional misalignment, that goes back to the earlier survey of who owns, cash conversion cycle. Well, and a lot of times it's, well, either no one person owns it or that person is so high that it's not really being actively managed on a tactical way. So I'll take the left side here and then hand things off to Brock. When we talk about orchestration, there are silos, and rightly so, but they need to all talk to each other. And so when you look at the left side, historically, credit, if we're being honest with ourselves, has drowned in manual data entry, has effectively been an escalation point for collections versus their true job of managing AR credit quality. They're drowning in requests to relieve credit order blocks. They are just manual data entry of financials, and that's not what they're meant to do, right? They're meant to accelerate new customer onboarding and manage the risks associated with the timing disconnect between the sales of goods and services and the collection of cash and goods and services. That's their mandate. But historically, it's been manual data entry, collections escalation, and credit order block releases, right? And that's not been their job. In the middle, you have your core AR, your RevRec, you're creating invoices with the right pricing, managing disputes and facing off with your counterparts on the P2P side of the house, and ultimately applying cash. Again, that has been the focus of quote unquote transformation. It's always been, how can I do this as cheaply as possible? Well, that's great, but if you look at the value proposition of what order to cash should be, it's cash acceleration, minimization of bad debt, minimization of revenue leakage, and really the fourth priority is cost of operations, not just send it to India and do it as cheaply as possible, right? And so, but to do that, you want to have pricing go out the door as accurately as possible, or downstream, you're just creating pain for yourself, right? And then collections, again, in the old world, people were spending the first half of their day building a collector work list and the second half of their day acting against it. Now you can hit the ground running with all of that created as soon as you log into your computer on day one. Some of that correspondence can be automated. You can really have a view that has morphed beyond days and dollars past due, and now to when do people pay? When do their batch processes run? Where do I have a promise to pay? How risky is this customer? And then integrating that with customer treatment strategies and segmentation. So now you're really optimizing collector effectiveness, and minimizing bad debt, while at the same time treating your customer in the way that you optimally want to. In the middle, obviously, is treasury, and I'll hand things off to Brock.
I want to say a couple quick comments here, and then Kyle, I'll hand it to you, and I'll close it out. But I think what Ben just said is critical, right? You heard multiple times. Cash orchestration is critical, but you're thinking about it in domains, in your separate silos, your separate columns, right? And the challenge for everybody in this call, whether you're in treasury, or order to cash, you're a CFO, or you're in procurement, is to challenge you to think holistically, right? So please take a moment, pause, soak up this slide. I think there's so much value in the slide to extract, and I want to encourage everybody listening to think through what you own explicitly versus what is more tangential to your day-to-day, and where you may become a better business partner to somebody else in a different silo, and how you can bridge those gaps. So take this time as Kyle shares about source to pay, and then I'll wrap with treasury about where you can zone in fully, where you have full control versus where you don't, and obviously lean into both. Please think about how you can be, the term I would like to use is enterprise-wide impact, right? If you're focused in one of these domains today, you're making a big impact, but you can make a bigger enterprise-wide impact if you think about all three. And that's the encouragement of today's webinar. Think about where you can tap into next. Kyle?
Thanks, Brock. So I'll hit the source to pay points quickly because a lot of them are frankly corollaries to what Ben spoke about on the front end. But key themes remain, right? And first is oftentimes you'll have at least 3, if not sometimes more, process owners that sit within the source to pay domain, right? You'll have procurement and sourcing, which sits on the front end. You'll have invoicing and AP, which is usually a finance activity. And then payments sometimes can sit inside accounts payable, but oftentimes that'll sit in treasury. And each of them have a critical role to play with regards to the impact that the source to pay or DPO domain has on overall working capital. We take sourcing and purchasing. I mentioned one earlier around incorporating payment terms into the full balanced supplier scorecard as to how you negotiate contracts and commercial terms with suppliers, as opposed to just unit price. On the AP and invoicing side, this is without an efficient and effective AP process, you're unable to pay or to make payments in a manner that makes the most sense for you and your organization. Oftentimes, what will happen if things fall behind in AP is treasury or whoever's owning payments at your company is going to make payments as soon as the invoice has been approved, because the alternative is not worth it with regards to vendor escalations or the like. In contrast, if invoicing and AP has an efficient process, and frankly, a lot of this will stem up in purchasing, right? Are you heavy PO backed? Are you capturing the right information on the PO? Is your master data structure in such a way to facilitate an efficient 3-way match? Anyone on this phone who's in AP often knows that a lot of the AP challenges will stem upstream, but often get caught here. And then lastly, on the payment side, if you have an effective upstream process, it allows you to be more strategic around how you release funds to your suppliers, thinking about the overall value between cash on hand versus overall discount on the face value of the contract. So when do you want to take payment or discounts versus when do you not? And when do you maybe not want to pay on time and maybe defer a week or two because it makes the most sense for you and your business? So the important takeaway here is it's important to have a through line across all three. It's important for each function to understand the influence that the upstream and downstream counterparts have in the overall success of DPO. And without strong upstream data and good processes to facilitate your AP match, it renders companies behind the 8 ball with regards to how they think about payment and working capital strategy with regards to DPO.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Kyle. Let's wrap it up with treasury and think through some of these domains. And coming back to my comment I made a couple minutes ago, obviously I want to focus on these domains for just a moment, but I want to look at the bottom first, the sequence, right? We're looking at customer to sales, open AR collections, cash into treasury, and then treasury's positioning the cash, executing on decisions, maybe hedging and investing. And then of course, those approved POs go to AP, approved invoices get paid, you get cash out, and then treasury comes back full circle, right? So treasury is in some respect a bit of the glue or the central hub that's reporting out on a lot of this activity, right? So let's double click on each one of these, because I think you're going to find the problems here fastest, right? You can look upstream, you can look downstream. Treasury is uniquely positioned to solve this cash orchestration problem. So first, collect AP, AR inputs, just describe that. When you look at bank balance feeds and building short-term forecasts, it is amazing how many clients we work with, Fortune 500, $1 billion plus in revenue, who barely have a position worksheet, right? They don't know how much cash they have. If they do know how much cash they have, they might have a short-term forecast, but they never question it. They never look at the changes. They never do a variance. Maybe they have a short-term forecast, but they don't have a long-term forecast, right? it's relegated to FP&A, and nobody ever agrees, and they've just decided not to fight a battle at all, right? And if they do have a short-term and a long-term forecast, the variance analysis, right? Ben mentioned it a couple minutes ago. If you know there's a variance, but you're not doing anything about it, you're missing out. You're losing cash for your business. You have a strategic opportunity to make an enterprise-wide impact that you might not be making in full today. Right? So take an opportunity and question, hey, Treasury, do we have a forecast variance analysis, right? What are we doing about it if we do see a variance analysis? Who are we going back to say this needs to get better, right? Are you positioning yourself as the person protecting this cash, moving it forward, investing it wherever possible? And if not, maybe now's the day to take the nudge and make sure you're doing that for your enterprise, right? And then liquidity and risk, right? Thinking about gap analysis with what cash you need on hand versus what's available. Maybe you have excess cash and you're not investing it. That's a problem, right? You're missing an opportunity to not only keep your cash safe, but then invest what you can. FX hedging, debt management, all critical aspects of managing capital, your cross-cultural exposures. You have so many things to keep in mind here. Make sure that the data you're using is right and you're benefiting from what is coming upstream, going downstream. Make sure that you have all the data at your disposal. Typically using a TMS is the greatest way to accelerate that exercise. A lot of us, I think 40% of you said data gaps and system gaps are an issue. If you don't have a TMS, you should probably look into one. Right? And then let's talk about the data inputs you should be looking at. Let's look at the KPIs, because at the end of the day, as you all know, if you're not measuring it, it's not going to improve. Right? So think about measuring some of these KPIs you see, your forecast accuracy, your cost of liquidity, right? Ultimately, everything we're talking about today is about your cash conversion cycle. So make sure that formula is primed and that you're considering every input, and like we talked about at the beginning, those volatile inputs that are affecting your CCC. And make sure you're thinking about how to improve it as a holistic business, not just your piece of the pie. So I want to share a quick example of this with a recent retail client. But before I leave this slide, I just want to give everybody a chance to either take a screenshot, know that we will share this deck afterwards. It'll be uploaded as materials. And then for the people who have sent in questions already, please know we will get to them at the end. Thank you for submitting them. Please keep submitting more. We'll try to make sure that we get to all of them. But thank you for paying attention thus far. I'm going to share one quick retail example, and then we'll keep cracking on. So let's talk about a great example of everything that we've discussed today, right? A company that decided, and this was actually in particular a treasury entity that decided to connect all these dots to reach out to the other departments, make sure that they had unified considerations with pain points and with their aspirations across their entire enterprise. Global retail company, decentralized international operations. They really didn't have a centralized view of cash pooling and in-house banking, so we helped create one. We partnered with them and we created an in-house bank and a cash pool. But before we ever thought about putting something in place, technology or structure or otherwise, we followed the practical transformation framework that you're going to see in a couple minutes. And we thought through data, we thought through partnership across the business. We made sure to think through intercompany transfers, intercompany balances, and we needed to make sure that regional controllers, corporate treasury, AP, AR, all had a seat at the table in these war rooms that we did with this particular client. And it was a fantastic experience because you got to see so many different aspects of the business, so many different incentives, thinking about what they cared about most. Not only that, though, but making sure they realized that the end vision was something that was more connected than they'd ever experienced before. And thankfully, that led to an incredible impact. In 3 months, this particular client, through cash pooling efforts, saved over $385,000 USD in interest savings alone, just by having a more intuitive, connected system that prevented them, or that allowed them to actually replace their revolver usage with a centralized liquidity platform. So really exciting use case, so much benefit that I think all the people in this webinar could benefit from, if not already doing cash pooling or in-house banking, and leveraging potentially a TMS or a connected data system to do that. So just one way to think about how you can implement something. Think about FX hedging and unified structures, and make sure that you're centralizing whatever you can. All right, I'm going to pass it on, and we're going to now talk about a practical framework. I'll highlight a couple things here, but I do want Kyle and Ben to just highlight briefly their thoughts on this matter as well, see if there's anything else that I missed. So I shared with you a moment ago that this retail giant followed this framework, and I'd like to share it with you now. We first thought about data and visibility. We made sure there was a unified cash data model. You have to do the same thing. Right? You have to make sure that there's unification in your data, and make sure that you know where the cash sits. Clean inputs is really what leads to that, and making sure that you're thinking about holistic forecasting and the data that's coming in. I can't tell you how many times our treasurers are saying, well, we don't really trust the data that's coming in. And like Ben said a moment ago, we really increased that threshold by 20 or 25% because we've had a bad day 3 years ago, right? And then before you get to process integration, or before you get to tech enablement, you think about process integration and making sure that you're aligning those treasury flows. It was an amazing experience to be able to sit in and watch the flows of each source to pay, order to cash owner, and treasury owner think through where their portion of the business stops and where somebody else's picks up and takes up what's been given to them. Standardizing those handoffs, thinking about controls, audit trails, ensuring that cash is embedded in operations is critical before you try to add technology to it. Right? And of course, in the age of AI, you can introduce technology and enablement and make sure people are trained on it. But if the tools are mediocre or if the data is not connected, then you're probably not going to get a whole lot of great output with those technologies, AI or SaaS or otherwise. So be thinking about how your ERP does or doesn't connect to a TMS or a source to pay solution or a forecast solution or a cash application solution, and make sure that you're automating what you can. There are so many instances where most companies really are less than 50% automation when it comes to their matching processes, whether it's in treasury or record to report or cash application. There's missing value on the table when you're not matching as much through automation as possible. And then finally, governance and thinking about the model moving forward. Who owns the cash? Get back to those cross-functional KPIs that Kyle Rogers talked about, and make sure that you're putting people in the same room whenever you need to, right? In the virtual age and today, it's harder to get in person, but it's critical to have a setting like a war room where you can sit in the same room and talk through end-to-end workflows. Make sure your KPIs are tracked, monitored so that you can improve them, and make sure you sustain the gains that you invest in these, right? So be thinking about these pillars. Where do you need to start in your enterprise, in your business? Do you need to focus on data and visibility? 40% of you said yes earlier today. Do you need to focus on process integration? Just get people in the same room talking about the flows, standardizing the handoffs, right? Or is it time to pursue technology? Right? Do you have 1 and 2 done? Do you need to implement technology or optimize the technology that you're currently using? And then finally, are you thinking about governance holistically? Who's owning cash? Making sure there's process owners, making sure there's somebody who's accountable at the end of the day, not just the CFO of your working capital and the solutions associated with them. Kyle, Ben, I want to give you all a second to highlight on some of these, and then Ben will pick up with the next slide.
Sure. I think, all of us hear AI all day long these days. And I think the challenge is, well, what's a real world use case that isn't, creating fun videos online? Like, how can I apply this to what I do every day? And I would tell you that cash forecasting is a massive opportunity to deploy machine learning in the real world to drive tangible benefits. So I'll tell you about a project that I led a few years ago. This was a company that was spreadsheet dependent, and they had different business units that had different models. They were just rolling everything up with a spreadsheet, and they were plus minus 40% on a quarterly basis every single quarter, and we're just basically getting laughed out of the room during their investor relations calls. And again, it was just every time you rolled up a spreadsheet that had some degree of uncertainty in it, that uncertainty multiplies, and ultimately they were just doing a terrible job. We deployed machine learning, and this was years ago, so there have been advances since. And so not only were we able to skip, to the historical 30, 60, 90 past due spreadsheet world, we brought in financial data, operational data in terms of orders, in terms of payroll, in terms of leases, and then we're actually able to bring in external macroeconomic data. And so we figured out, okay, we have a laundry list of everything that could theoretically impact cash flow. What actually does? And we were able to build real world models that got them from plus minus 40% to under plus minus 5%, architect that, So instead of in a manually time-consuming process that you could only run once a quarter, we got that down to months and then weeks because the data orchestration was there. Because if you think about what is a good use case for AI, it's high volume of data, data that is structurally stable, meaning you're not getting new data types and data elements. The data itself changes over time, but structurally the data is stable. It's high volume and it's repeatable. And then you have a consistent output that you can judge its accuracy and refine it over time. So, once you build all that, architect it, and get that into a single place, that's where you can really start driving volume. And again, the better your forecasts are, the less you have to value, the less you have to borrow in order to meet your funding commitments. So now we can start talking about, instead of over borrowing, I'm either borrowing less while I optimize cash flow, I reinvest more. This has fundamental impacts on your overall weighted average cost of capital across the organization. So if you're looking for a real world, it's been done, it's not theory world, it's been executed. Cash flow forecasting with AI is probably one of the best ones out there. So I'll pivot now. Again, I said this earlier, it's something that, a lot of us passionately believe in. Order to cash has always been thought of as low-end transaction processing, right? That's never what it was meant to be. But with the state of technology, that's all it was really able to be. So, everything was offline, you know, data coming in different formats, anything from remittance advice to financial statements required manual data entry, whether that's your people doing it or paying for bank keying fees and someone else's people are doing it. So manual data entry, you're always playing catch up. Again, credit order blocks, disputes, cash application. It's paperwork world, right? So, a trap there is to say, okay, today this doesn't add value, so I just want to do it as cheaply as possible. So the trap is to say, I'm going to transform this by offshoring and maybe automating cash application, right? And then all I get out of that is, yeah, your cost to serve is lower, but you're not really driving value. And again, especially with order cash as an example, but across the board, the the headcount reduction shouldn't be your primary or even secondary goal. What you're trying to do is drive much more value, right? Think of the difference between reducing your net interest expense as you accelerate cash coming in, reduce cash going out, reduce borrowing costs. All of that hits net interest expense through your weighted average cost of capital. That dwarfs the number of people you could save by, okay, I got to cut loose 2 people doing cash application. It's just a different order of magnitude, right? When thinking about revenue leakage, you're giving away unearned discounts because your sales force has no incentive to say no. All they care about is volume. Well, yeah, back end margin, adjusted gross margin after discounts and rebates, they don't care about it all if they even think about it, right? And then reducing bad debt as well, as you reduce the downside of effectively lending goods and services for a 30-day period. So up until the past, maybe 3 to 5 years ago, none of that was possible. But now we do have enablers where you can look at a single end-to-end process, both across sub-process areas, but across business units, across ERPs. You can nearly all documents can be digitized. All documents being digitized kills manual data entry, but then builds much richer data sets. So, as we apply OCR, we're digitizing documents, data becomes standard. Those standard data models support not only transaction processing, but real-time business insights. So we can now take all of that together. And then, when you look at, geopolitical instability, what's going on in the Middle East and the Strait of Hormuz, right? War in Ukraine, significant deficit spending, which ultimately will drive up borrowing costs across the board. If we remember aggregate supply, aggregate demand from our econ classes, and ultimately how that flows into, deficit spending raises costs of borrowing eventually, and then overall changes in demographics. There's a ton of inflection coming in right now, where, as we said before, post the banking crisis, post the big crash, post too big to fail, cash was effectively free for at least a decade. Now it isn't, and that is not going to change. If anything, it's going to get worse.
Perfect. So I'll talk about how companies typically tackle this in a meaningful and practical way. We've talked a lot on this call about the importance of cross-functional alignment, and that is not only within finance, but that is critically with business partners that often sit outside finance to drive success in this space. That can yield a point of paralysis for many companies, where without the idea of getting all those stakeholders aligned, why even bother? So we're actually seeing companies, and we advise companies to take a two-pronged approach on this. First is, if you're not going to think about this strategically and holistically, real meaningful change will certainly be hard. However, that does not mean that quick wins are not available for companies to capture in a functional or cross-functional manner. And this can cross not only AR and AP and also treasury, things like Ben's talked about this at length, but around how you clean up your AR aging and collection strategy to drive more timely payment and more compliant payments from your customers. On the AP side, we're seeing a lot of companies be more thoughtful around how they do their payment runs, as opposed to, we had one client that for years did, as soon as an invoice was approved, they paid it. Same day, didn't even have payment runs. It was a daily payment run for all approved invoices. And so now that things have changed from a market dynamic standpoint, they've asked themselves, can they be more thoughtful and intentional around when they pay those invoices? And they should not necessarily pay them when they've been approved. So that has led into not only more timely and strategic payment decisions, but also has enabled them to start asking more rich commercial questions around, are we even negotiating the right terms on these contracts to begin with? We had another client actually that drove quick wins on the front end. They had, I believe, 46 different payment terms across their supply base, and they drove a rationalization exercise that took a matter of a couple months to get them down to what I believe was 46 to south of 8 unique payment terms. So not only does that let them be more thoughtful around how they negotiate with their suppliers, but also renders a much more consistent experience for AP and treasury around how they ultimately remit payment to that supply base. On the strategic side, I think the biggest and most fundamental driver to success here is cultural. And this is getting not only finance cross-functionally, but as I mentioned earlier, your business stakeholders on the commercial side and pricing and sourcing and procurement to understand the importance of working capital of the business and think about a 360-degree view of how those functions are measured and incentivized to drive good behavior here. The second is around integrating your technology. Ben spoke about a great machine learning example earlier. So what was once the across the frontier is now attainable for many companies, and we're seeing them bring it to life today. And then ultimately this yields through end-to-end process transformation. This is through integrated process design, clean and consistent handoffs across functions, but also within functions to yield the true strategic advantage that companies are capturing from a working capital standpoint. I believe we're going to move to the fourth and final polling question, which may be up on your screen here in a moment. I'll read this one out loud. Where are you most likely to pursue quick wins in the next 90 days? Is that in accounts payable? Is that in accounts receivable? Is that in treasury and cash? Is that in risk and hedging? Or we're actually tackling this programmatically and thinking about this from a strategic transformational standpoint. It looks like a bit of a mixed bag across the board. AR, treasury, and encouragingly, approaching this programmatically is actually the front runner, getting half of the votes thus far. Perfect. Yeah, we're seeing an even mix between treasury and programmatic end to end.
With accounts payable in last place.
Yeah, this is fascinating.
Believe it or not, we thought that the fourth and final question, approaching this programmatically, would be last. So it's encouraging that it's first, and I think it's a good sign that you all are having conversations internally at all of your companies around this being an important initiative, this being an important driver, and how you can not only drive improvements within your functional area, but also across your business partners to really yield true value from a cash standpoint for your companies.
If we shook out at 40% programmatically, 40% treasury and cash, and then a smattering between receivables and payables with the remaining 20 or so percent. Okay. This is great. Hey, we've got 5 minutes left for a couple questions. Let's see who wants to take the first one. We have an ERP, we have a TMS, and we have an AR tool, but they're not connected. So maybe the question is, what should we do? Anybody want to take that one?
Yeah. So there's a lot of synergistic value if you do connect them. At the very least, you should be using your treasury tool as a central repository for all your banking files that can then fit into an AR tool and really drive volume on cash application as a very, very, very low hanging fruit. That's an opportunity, especially for folks who have multi ERPs. I would then tell you, say they're not connected. A lot of times, one of the things we help our clients with is an overall, enterprise architecture review. What are you doing in your ERP, and what should stay there, and what probably shouldn't? If you say you have an AR tool, okay, is it one? Is it many? What are you using it for? And then if you have a treasury tool, a TMS, what are you using that for? And then what does that overall ecosystem look like as part of enabling an overall operating model? So, as you implement these tools, they're never going to be silver bullets unless you're looking at them strategically and unless they're part of an overall operating model that is aligned to a strategic vision. A lot of times you just have a lot of technical debt and a bunch of stuff that's been there for 10 years, and this is just what we have. A lot of our clients want to now take a thoughtful pause and say, what do I want my landscape to look like in the future? And what do I want my overall operating model, inclusive of the right process, the right governance, the right controls, and then also obviously the right technology?
Yeah, I mean, connecting them is a no-brainer, right? But you do want to make sure that the data inputs feeding the system are correct, right? If you have bad data in, bad data is going to come out. So be thinking about data cleanup, right? Think about cleaning up your vendor master data list, right? Be thinking about the payment file instructions that are coming into your TMS. Do you have an opportunity to standardize that data before you connect them? But certainly, once it is clean data, you should connect them, benefit from that cross-functional collaboration. Next question. Our CFO talks a lot about working capital optimization, but we don't have anybody else who owns the process. Who should own it? I'll take that one as a very biased answer. I think Treasury could own it, should own it. It should be cross-functional in nature, though, right? It should be typically maybe somebody in Treasury, sitting in Treasury with that mandate to connect, to span across AP and AR, to be thinking about holistically the cash conversion cycle and being the final person, where the buck stops after the CFO or before the CFO to make sure that things are orchestrated as effectively as possible. There's exceptions to that rule. Somebody might be better suited, but at the end of the day, Treasury is perfectly prepared and positioned to consolidate data, report up into the CFO. Ben, Kyle, what do y'all think?
I would add, I agree. I think when we think about who's in charge of driving a centralized, consistent view of what a company's working capital position is and how they deploy their available cash, I think treasury is a great place to do it. I think companies that are actually approaching this from a transformational standpoint, it often starts with the CFO. My point of view, though, is it can't stop there. It actually should be a CEO initiative because of the interaction between certainly your operations and your supply chain function, but also your commercial function. And I think without the true executive top-down mandate, you can certainly drive meaningful progress within finance. I don't want to discount that, but leaders are certainly approaching this from not only a finance view, but also an integrated business view.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I just add that, to Kyle's point around should be a CEO initiative, not just a CFO initiative. It's almost impossible to own and control all of this. Really, what you need is someone at the very least who has a coordination function across, again, because it's going to involve sales, it's going to involve logistics, inventory management, supply chain, demand and supply forecasting, accounts payable, accounts receivable. I think treasury is ideally positioned, especially where treasury owns some of these underlying functions. Credit sometimes sits in treasury versus accounts receivable. Running payments sometimes sits in treasury versus in AP, right? So especially where treasury owns some of those sub-process areas, as well as being the coordinator of overall cash, treasury is likely the owner. Otherwise, if you have a really strong finance transformation organization, a fully empowered global business services organization, someone who has that type of mandate might own it as well. But typically, it's going to be someone who is sitting in or at least adjacent to treasury.
Nice. All right, y'all, let's wrap up with a quick comment. Metrics are always important in building a business case. And if you're on this webinar, I hope you've built a business case or you plan on building one to think about holistic cash out orchestration. So, companies that are connecting AP actuals to treasury forecasting are typically going to reduce their forecast error by 30 to 40%, right? Every 1% improvement in a 13-week forecast is going to reduce the buffer cash that you have, right? It's going to be quantified against your cost of capital or cost of liquidity. If you have fragmented banking structures, you're typically holding 15 to 20% excess liquidity as a buffer. If you can improve your forecasting, think about cash orchestration holistically across the enterprise, you can reduce that. Right? If you start incorporating credit scoring, you're going to be able to cut bad debt. Typically, that's a couple percentage points. And then if you can increase your AP automation match rates, you'll stop missing the 1 to 2% invoice value that you're not capturing through early payment discounts, right? So there's so many reasons to think about improving, so many metrics to capture. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is that most companies treat that cash conversion cycle as a finance problem. But as Kyle said, it's an operational one. Think about holistic. The biggest gains you're going to get are going to come from attacking all three levers at once, right? DSO, DIO, DPO, not isolated application or optimization, right? So thank you for joining us, joining Clearsulting in this webinar. We hope you have a lovely day and that you learned something and that you will take this back to your company and think about enterprise-wide impact. Goodbye.
Thank you.